We are asking for a general strike to keep organized labor on the Pacific Coast. We are not only asking for it, but we're going to get it.
Working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. At the top, they're telling you still, but first you must learn how to smile and to kill.
In the 1930s, the threat of revolution was real. In A People's History of the United States, author Howard Zinn points out that, quote, desperate people were not waiting for the government to help them, they were helping themselves, end quote. This call for fairness, humanity, and accountability in the business sector of America resonates loudly today in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is based on almost identical demands. The slogans are different, protesters employ different tactics, but movements now are founded on a social consciousness and expectations that were generated and explored during the last great economic crisis. Protesters of the 1930s sacrificed their lives for the regulations and union rights that are now once again the subject of national discourse. Understanding the strikers of the 30s can help us understand the occupiers of today. By 1931, the stock market crash had taken its toll, and as the economy fell, the need for strikes arose. With so many people out of work and desperate for food, shelter, and other basic necessities, the spirit of rebellion was growing. Nowhere was this brewing discontent more evident than in Harlan County, Kentucky. A New York Times special investigator said of the Harlan strikes, quote, in its broad essentials, the plight of Harlan is the same as that of other coal areas with a few exceptions, end quote. Those exceptions had much to do with scale. Harlan County was a primary artery of the nation's coal supply. In 1928, Harlan produced 3 times the amount of any other mining community in the nation. Yet, by 1931, miners with families saw their wages reduced to $4 or $5 per week. There was no plumbing in the mining camps, and disease was rampant. In Camp Carey, home to 125 families, an average of 7 children died each week. In February 1931, wages were cut yet again, and the miners rebelled. Companies sought to suppress the uprising quickly and violently. Meeting places were dynamited, miners were beaten, and unions of any kind were deemed criminal enterprises. On May 5th, miners and deputies engaged in what became known as the Battle of Efforts. Between 4 and 11 men were killed, and 34 miners were arrested. After the Battle of Everett, Governor Flem Sampson called in the National Guard and promised medical aid, food, and the removal of armed guards from the mines, but he reneged on the deal. In 1932, the American Civil Liberties Union published a report detailing the miners' struggle through a series of daily accounts and stories. In one of these accounts, Waldo Frank, Malcolm Cowley, and a group of writers from New York drove trucks full of food and clothing to donate to the besieged miners. In Cowley's ensuing article, Kentucky Coal Town, deputies arrest the group, confiscate much of the supplies, and escort the riders back to the Kentucky state line in the middle of the night. Upon reaching the state line, deputies hit Waldo Frank and another rider over the head, leaving them bleeding on the ground. One of the 2 men screams, and the deputies retreat. Cowley credited the man who screamed with saving their lives. Through these articles, Malcolm Cowley, Waldo Frank, and many other activists alerted the nation of the morally indefensible actions of owners and officials with a collective scream. It was a cry of defiance as the marginalized and mistreated working class bled in the dark. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt landslid into the presidency. Howard Zinn argues that when Roosevelt came into office, he, quote, had to meet 2 pressing needs: to reorganize capitalism to overcome the crisis and stabilize the system, also to head off the alarming growth of spontaneous rebellion, end quote. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, was Roosevelt's attempt to accomplish both of these tasks. Passed on June 16, 1933, Section 7A guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively free of interference from employers, while Section 7B stipulated the minimum wage, maximum working hours, and decent working conditions. The legislation precipitated a spat of strikes across the U.S. as various unions fought the entrenched forces of labor for recognition and the rights guaranteed by the NIRA. The longshoremen of the West Coast went on just such a strike. The 1934 Longshore Strike, or the West Coast Waterfront Strike, began on May 9th and lasted 83 days through July 31st. Triggered by the larger San Francisco General Strike, longshoremen all across the West Coast quickly joined the effort, which was led by the International Longshoremen Association, the ILA. Strikers demanded higher wages, a shorter workday, ILA recognition by the employers, and union control of the waterfront hiring halls. The longshoremen cooperated with warehousemen and truck drivers who refused to handle or haul freight unloaded by strikebreakers to completely shut down the port. The strike took a violent turn in July when companies began moving freight from a pier that was operating without strikers. The strikers reacted through violent protest, overturning trucks that were carrying freight. The rioting began on July 3rd, quieted during the 4th, and then erupted again in full force on July 5th. On what came to be known as Bloody Thursday, 2 men were killed by police bullets and another by injuries. 31 others were shot, and an untold number, including police, were clubbed, gassed, beaten, and stoned. The National Guard arrived at the waterfront to restore order. In the end, the longshoremen won a wage increase, union-run hiring halls, and reduced hours. However, mainstream newspapers at the time covered the events with an anti-strike bias, focusing on the strike's negative impact to business. The Seattle Times went so far as to claim that the strike impeded the state's economic recovery from the Great Depression. Howard Zinn chronicles the earliest throes of the Great Depression and tells of the American working class caught in the crossfire of an ineffective government and a greedy business sector. With no help in sight, the working class used whatever means necessary to obtain relief. Not only did individuals fight for basic needs such as food and medicine, but whole communities pooled resources to provide for each other. These sentiments are alive and evident in protests all over America today. Then and now, as citizens became more desperate for relief from financial duress and unfair working conditions, they began to recognize protests and strikes as a valuable form of demonstrating that safety, fairness, and responsibility in America's business and financial sectors are just as important as profits.